Thank y'all. How many of you are ready to take back America? I am too. All of us at Heritage are. I'm going to tell you about our plan to do so. It really rests on you, so just be prepared for that. But before I do that, how about all of us show our gratitude to the Centennial Institute and Colorado Christian University for putting on a great show. Y'all are really kind to this guy who has shown up from the swamp, but I will assure you, while I now work in the swamp, I am not of the swamp. And I'm also here to assure you that all of us at the Heritage Foundation, and you've already heard in some of the workshops from some of my colleagues, you will hear from some others over the weekend, that we are here to give you the intellectual ammunition to take back the United States of America for good. I love the theme of this year's conference, Saddle Up and Ride. It reminds me of my adopted home in Texas, which I left. I'm that crazy guy who left Texas and went to the swamp. But it also reminds me of my time in Wyoming. And several years ago, when I was president of Wyoming Catholic College, came to one of the first meetings here at the Western Conservative Summit when it was a little bit smaller. And it was also a time when a certain man named Barack Obama was president of the United States. And that president of the United States told our college that we had to submit to all parts of Obamacare, even though one of them, the contraceptive mandate, violated our religious liberty. And see, we told him to go pound sand. And with the Little Sisters of the Poor, much more famous than we were fittingly, we beat them at the U.S. Supreme Court. And you know, being a guy who was raised to sort of hate government overreach, I decided that we were going to go on offense. And as we were coming up for accreditation, we decided we don't want federal student loans and grants from the federal government. Keep your money and go pound sand a second time. And so there at that little college, this is the point. The spirit of the West, the spirit of saddling up and riding, which we did at the college, we taught, and the college still teaches, all freshmen how to ride a horse, backpacking, fly fishing, hunter safety certification, all these politically incorrect things. The point is, in the air of the Rocky Mountain West, I developed this passion for public policy. And the short version of the story is that when the Heritage Foundation came calling last year, I certainly didn't think they were going to choose me. I am, after all, a DC outsider. I wear boots. For the mainstream media, I own a lot of guns, a lot of them. And Mrs. Roberts is a better shot than I am, so don't mess with her either. But this is the point, folks. It was in the Rocky Mountain West, in a scene not unlike what we see when we step outside this beautiful hotel, that I realized the Lord was calling me, as He's called each of you and millions of Americans, to sacrifice a little bit more. And so even though we loved it out there, and even though we loved our time in Texas, it is a great privilege to be in Washington, D.C., at least during the day. I sleep in Virginia. But during the day in D.C., to be there on your behalf. As we like to say at Heritage, we are the people's representative behind enemy lines. And what I want to do for you today, in the little bit of time we have together, is to outline 3 particular ways that all of us together, using the talents we've been given respectively by our Creator, what we can do with those talents, in fact, to restore the institutions of this country. First of all, let me just give you a very sober account of what's going on in Washington, D.C. The headline that I would write, to quote Ronald Reagan specifically, is that we do the Lord's work in the devil's city. And so much of what's going on in Washington, D.C. is this battle between the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans. We know that President Biden, bless his heart, has some shortcomings. I'll talk about a couple of them here in a minute. But the point that I'm driving at, folks, and this is the historian coming out, is that the battle that we're fighting is not Republican versus Democrat, right versus left. The battle that we're fighting is the elites versus the rest of us. And so we have to recognize, thank you, we have to recognize that as we think about rebuilding, recohering, rejuvenating the conservative movement, that it's far more important for us to be conservatives first before we talk about a particular party affiliation. And I say that, speaking in my personal capacity, as the first Republican in my family, growing up in the Gulf Coast in a working class family where I realized Ronald Reagan was a great model, a role model. I was quoting him when I wasn't even 10 years old saying, government is not the solution, it's the problem. Our leadership in Washington, D.C. on our side, and I say this respectfully with Christian charity, needs to remember that. And so when the Biden administration talks about more COVID mandates like remasking us on airplanes, they need to stand up to that. When the Biden administration, when the transportation secretary says that the way to fight high gas prices is for us to buy electric vehicles, our leadership in D.C. needs to stand up against that. When the Biden administration says that we are going to call apolitical Christian charitable parents domestic terrorists, our leadership needs to stand up. And the problem is that too much of D.C. is in cahoots with this World Economic Forum, with the economic forum that's meeting in D.C. now, some of them good people, but we have to send Washington, D.C. a message that we've had enough and we want our country back. It really is that simple. And just in case I forget to mention it later, whether in my talk or out in the halls, as I hope to get to meet a lot of you, you are always welcome at Heritage. You should sort of think of the Heritage Foundation as the American people's lobbying firm for what is good and right and common sense. So come by and see us. In fact, at the March for Life in January, I know many of you go to that, as I have for many years running. At Heritage, we heard from the mayor of D.C. that no one should be having a lot of people in their building because of COVID vaccine mandates and because of testing requirements. And so what we decided to do was invite in the entire pro-life world into our building. And it just tickled me pink that several hundred pro-lifers came into our building that day in the spirit of conservative hospitality. I'm going to come back to that theme in a moment. But the second thing that I want to highlight for you, in case you haven't had the opportunity to see it, is the plan that the Heritage Foundation has put together for taking back our country. In your wonderful packets with information from all the other great organizations is this little brochure from the Heritage Foundation entitled Fighting for America's Future. And in that little brochure, you're going to see the entire history of American conservative policy thought. We are, after all, and I say this with great humility, one of the largest public policy organizations in the world. In fact, some years I think we are the largest. We're certainly the largest right of center. And I can tell you, if you haven't figured it out yet, we are pretty conservative. In this little pamphlet, you will see all of the policies that, if we can enact them at the federal level and also at the state level, gives us the blueprint for governing this country. In fact, while I don't mean this to be offensive to anyone running for office this fall, and God bless them for being the men and women in the arena being willing to do that, ultimately, it's not enough to have a Republican majority next January if they're not going to govern as conservatives. It really is that simple. What I'm saying, my friends, is that this is the solution. Get elected, have a conservative majority in the House and the Senate and governorships and state legislatures, but then govern like you are reflecting the will of the people. And you and I both know, in spite of what the mainstream media tells us, in spite of what polling somehow is supposed to suggest to us, that this country is a center-right majority country, and we're tired of being told otherwise. So the first part The first priority, as you see there, is to empower parents and enact universal school choice to the point that every dollar we spend on education in this country follows every student for the purposes of the school that their parent chooses. It is not enough, and I'm a fifth-generation educator, proud graduate of a public school. I've never attended anything but a public school. It is not enough for Republican governors and legislators and congressmen to tell us that's just too hard. We've learned from COVID, we've learned from critical race theory, we've learned from the transgender extreme agenda that it is time for every American dollar to follow every American child. And one way that we can achieve that is to make sure that every state legislature over the next couple of legislative sessions enacts universal school choice. But the other way, if you will permit me to say something that's not popular in Washington, D.C., is to tear out, root and branch every part of the U.S. Department of Education, full stop. You see, it was the U.S. Department of Education and their accrediting organizations that are in the same cabal who told me, as president of that tiny college in Wyoming, you know, Dr. Roberts, you might want to rethink this position. It's going to be really bad for you. Coming from a bureaucrat, I realized do the exact opposite. The other area that we have to focus on, and it is one that is not just sobering but tragic, is our border and the rising crime rates in this country. You and I have the burden of living at a time in American history when the rule of law is not respected. It's not respected at our southern border. It's not respected by mayors of large cities. And I really do lament saying this because I try to be a nice guy. It is not respected by the President and Vice President of the United States. Therefore, when there is a conservative majority just months from now, we need to be sure that even though we're not going to be able to be in control of the White House until 2025, that those conservatives in Congress act with the courage we need them to have so that every state and every county is in fact one where the rule of law prevails. Of course, as a nation, we grieve with those in Uvalde and anywhere gun violence occurs. But as I mentioned last night in response to the president's ridiculously passionate address, unless he wants to talk about the crisis of fatherhood, the crisis of masculinity, the crisis of no morality, the crisis of the breakdown of the family, the crisis of mental health, and what public schools have done to our kids, be quiet. It's not about guns. Thirdly, you probably know this, and if you don't, you'll hear from my colleague Hans in the coming hours about Heritage's work on election integrity. We were doing that well before 2020. We recognized that election integrity was a problem well before we all understood it to be a couple of Novembers ago. And I'm here to tell you that while we have made some progress as a country, we really have. You can look at our election integrity scorecard and see that. We still have a lot of progress to make. And I just want to give you a little bit of cautious optimism. I think as a result of a lot of the laws that were passed, because of your work, because of the work of my colleagues at Heritage and many other organizations, this November's elections will be more transparent. But until and unless we as a people can be confident that every vote of every American is in fact cast, it is not changed through vote trafficking, it's not changed through other means, we have to continue to work on this issue, and we will not stop at Heritage until we can say that. And fourth, we need to be aware, in case you aren't, that when we go to the grocery store, we're paying 25% more for eggs than we were last year, 30% more for milk. You know what's happening at the gas lines. And maybe some of us in this room can make do because of whatever material blessings we have. But I can tell you, from having grown up in a family that couldn't even live paycheck to paycheck, that this rate of inflation means many American families aren't buying milk. It's not that they aren't buying a gallon, they aren't buying it at all, they aren't buying meat, and we have the condescension from the elite administration to be quiet and suggest to us that it's transitory or a high-class problem. You see, what's going on with inflation is one of the clearest examples that this is a country that is run by elites. But the good news is the Lord always provides. That's going to be one of the major tools we can use to take this country back. And just to connect some dots, although you can connect dots far more accurately than anyone in Washington, D.C., the problem of inflation, the problem of government overspending, the Green New Deal, and the acquiescence to the communist Chinese are all connected. And so as you will see in our pamphlet, and I want to be really clear about this, the defining issue for the United States of America in the 21st century, the defining issue for Americans, for free people, for all people in the world in the 21st century is defeating the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, that involves adjusting our foreign policy. It involves adjusting our economic trade agreements in a way that helps Taiwan. But it also, I am sorry to say, involves ending the nefarious practice of Americans on K Street in Washington, D.C., being millionaires because they lobby for the CCP. It is time to end that practice immediately. You also might have noticed that these tech companies don't like the Heritage Foundation. And it's because we not only don't take their money, we can't be bought off, but we issued, keep in mind, we're a policy group, so we do some white papers. We take a lot of action on those white papers, but we came together and put together this white paper that said, big tech is an enemy of the people, and it's time that policymakers address it. And like you, I'm wary of government trying to fix anything. But like you, I also know American history, and I know that the antitrust laws are there for a reason, and they need to be used, and we need to break them up, and we need to be sure that you and I, as conservatives, can have free speech online. Last, as I begin to wrap up here, I've hit kind of hard, which is kind of what I do, but with a smile on my face, that we need to read reality truthfully, and reality isn't that pretty in D.C. most days. But reality this summer is that this month, in spite of the worst efforts of some clerk at the Supreme Court, the worst efforts of others on the radical left, this month, you and I will wake up and Roe versus Wade will be overturned. But that's when the work begins. And those of us who spend time praying, those of us who spend time studying history, studying Scripture know that that is a great blessing. But in order to enshrine that great victory in law, we have to be busy about passing pro-life legislation in every state and at the federal level. Heritage's position, in case anyone ever asks, is that until and unless we have a federal law that outlaws abortion from conception, we will not stop working, period. So let me sum up this way. People in the media, naysayers, would like to tell us that America is in the valley of valleys, that there's no hope for us to come out of that valley. There's no hope for us to get to that proverbial mountaintop that Reagan spoke about so eloquently. Heck, they would say there's not even hope to get to a hillside, let alone that mountaintop. But I'm here to tell you that in my study of history, Every single time America was in a valley and the Lord's people said, we've had enough and we want our country back, he did not forsake them and he did not forsake America. And he's not going to this time if you and I saddle up and ride. God bless you. Thank you.